Okay. I want to start by thanking our board members, our tech person, Tom Shoup back there, and our communications person, Connie Casey, also food person. There's, by the way, at the end, if there's still food left, please take it. Okay. I want to thank the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of New Bern for providing this venue, and the Public Radio East for advertising it on their on the station. If you like what we do, there's a donation box over there. We don't get money from grants or anything else but you all. So that's what we do. Yeah, so if you like what we do, please give us a donation. Also, if you don't happen to have it here, you can go to our website. There is a donation button online. All right. I'm very happy to have Dave Allen. Turns out that I was reading a newspaper article, and it mentioned him, and I said, boy, wouldn't it be nice to have someone to talk about the Red-Cockaded Woodpecker? Dave Allen. But how do I get in touch with him? So I was talking to someone, and they said, well, you know his wife, Janice. And so that's what I did. I got in touch with Janice, and Janice got in touch with David, and David was out in the field. And he said, I'm retired. He also said, don't you want to do a bird hike? And I said, yes, we would, but right now we would like to have you do a presentation. So that is how we got David here. Now, David Allen has a BS in forestry and wildlife from Virginia Tech, an MS in wildlife biology from Clemson University, 3 years working in the southeastern forest experimental station of the USDA, all right, and then 32 years working in North Carolina with the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission. So he started up north, then he went south, and finally he came to North Carolina. Thank you. All right. He was, most of the time, he was the Eastern Regional Non-Game Supervisor, and I've met some people who he supervised, and they were very happy. He is a good mentor. So, so without further ado, Dave Allen.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. Oops, watch your step there. Thank you, and thank you, Tom, for helping us set this video stuff up. All right, let's see. Where I think you took my notes. All right. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks to all of you for coming. I don't do this kind of thing very often anymore since I retired, and I don't really have the resources, so some of the slides will be a little bit iffy maybe, but we'll muddle through it pretty well. I had some slides. I borrowed some slides. Janice was nice enough to let me use her computer that had PowerPoint on it, because I didn't even have PowerPoint anymore on my computer. But I'm particularly glad because my wife Janice is here, and one of my very best friends, Eric Hoffman, is here also. Eric, well, all three of us, of course, are biologists. But Eric was a biologist on Fort Bragg for many years, and he's just retired too, and now lives in the area. So this is extra special for me. So Michael gave you a little bit of information about me. Started my career with the research branch of the Forest Service. That was a Southeastern Forest Experiment Station he was talking about. And that's where I started doing my red-cockaded woodpecker work. In fact, I was in charge of managing a population of woodpeckers on the Savannah River site at that time and doing research on red-cockaded woodpeckers at the time. And since then, since I left them in 1990, I've been working with North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission doing the non-game work, primarily non-game work, at least the last 27 years of those 32 anyway. But that's a little bit about me to help me understand how I can frame this presentation. Let me find out a little bit about you. How many of you, by a show of hands, would consider yourself birders? Say you go out every once in a while to look at birds or look for birds. That's most of us. Very good. How many of you would say you know a fair amount about red-cockaded woodpeckers? All right, still several. Well, good, good. All right. Well, of course, red-cockaded woodpeckers, sometimes you'll catch me saying RCW is kind of just a shorthand for red-cockaded woodpecker, and you'll see that a lot in the literature too. All right. So we'll start with a little description of red-cockaded woodpeckers. They are one of the ladderback woodpeckers that are about the size of a hairy woodpecker that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but they have that big white cheek patch on the side of their face. All of the ladderback woodpeckers have some kind of white on their head, but this is the only one that has that big white cheek patch. And they're called red-cockaded woodpeckers, although you don't really see much red on them. In fact, most of the time you won't see any red at all. The females don't have any red on their entire body. Only the male has a little bit of red that he keeps covered over most of the time, kind of behind his ear, a little bit of feather, a little bit of red feather behind his ear, and he keeps it covered over except for when he's agitated. If he's in a dispute with a male, he might show that, or if he's trying to show off to the ladies, he might show a little bit of that red. The birds are non-migratory, so they will stay in their territory all year long. And of course, they use these cavities, and we'll talk about those in a minute, but they use these cavities, and they will go back in those cavities every single night. It's not like most woodpeckers that nest in cavities only, use them during the nesting season, but the rest of the season, most woodpeckers don't go in holes, right? But red-cockaded woodpeckers, every single night, their entire lives, hopefully, they will have a cavity to get into and roost. They're considered cooperative breeders, red-cockaded woodpeckers are, because there are these helpers. The whole family group actually helps the breeding pair. So they live in these family groups, and younger birds from previous years stick around, usually males, and they will help the breeding pair conduct their breeding activities. They will defend the territory. They work on cavities and help excavate cavities. They will feed young. They may even actually incubate eggs and brood young. All the members of the family will do that. So that's why they're considered cooperative breeders, because they get a lot of help. Before I start talking about habitat, I want to mention a couple of terms that I will often use. Sometimes I use them kind of interchangeably. You heard me just mention the family group. Sometimes I'll just refer to that as group, or sometimes I even use an old term called clan. But all three of those terms, either clan or group or family group, pertains to the group of birds that are all together. They're roosting in trees close together. They stay together usually most of the day, and and they're usually all related. So that pertains to the birds, and all these birds live in a group of trees called either a cluster or a colony, and sometimes I'll use those terms interchangeably. Cluster or colony pertains to the trees that the birds live in, and they live in these family groups, and usually these trees are kind of clustered together, maybe in a 4 or 5 acre area. They have these trees, and you've probably seen them out on the Croatan National Forest, where the trees are painted with white bands, and you'll see those trees are always in clusters. Excuse me. All right, let's move on to the habitat. Now, the birds do depend on these old growth pine forests that are found here in the southeast. That's the only place that the birds are found, in the southeastern part of the United States. And they depend on old pines because as these pine trees get older, they get something called a red heart disease in the pines, and it actually attacks the heartwood. It's the center part of the tree, and it makes the center part of the tree a little bit soft. These birds only excavate their cavities in live pine trees, so it takes several months to several years for a cavity to be completed. That's a huge investment, a long time to try to excavate cavities. So that's why these cavities are so important to them, because they put so much time and effort into making them. But if a pine tree gets that red heart disease in it, once the bird excavates the entrance tunnel, slightly upward angle, he reaches the heartwood of the tree. If that pocket is a little bit rotten in there from that red heart disease, it enables him to scoop out the chamber of the cavity much easier. Still, several months to several years for these birds to excavate cavities. It's a long time. And of course, it takes a long time because these trees are alive. It's the only bird in our area that excavates cavities in live pine trees. This is another example of nesting habitat. Once again, old trees, fairly open grown. This one's a loblolly site. It has a little bit of hardwood in it. The birds will accept a little bit of hardwood, but they want mostly all pine. And as I said, the nesting habitat needs to be old growth. The red heart disease really doesn't get in the pines until somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 years to 80 years old or older. So that's why these birds, you're not going to find them nesting in a 40-year-old stand because there's just not enough red heart in the center of those pine trees in order for them to use it. The foraging habitat can be quite a bit younger. They don't have to have old growth to forage in, but they do need both nesting habitat and foraging habitat. So here's a good example of some foraging habitat. They do like bigger trees, but they will forage on small trees, exclusively pine again. They very rarely forage on hardwoods. It's just almost all pine. But you can understand that if they're foraging on very small pine trees, they spend more time flying from tree to tree than they do actually finding bugs on the boles of those trees. And these birds are exclusively insect eaters. They eat insects, spiders, larvae of insects, but they find these insects and spiders and stuff in the cracks, little crevices of the pine trees all year long. Even in the middle of the winter time, these birds are very good at finding these insects. They don't switch to berries or something like a bluebird would in the wintertime. On a real cold winter day, you'll see bluebirds switching mostly to berries, but red-cockaded woodpeckers are eating insects all year long. Another example of some forage habitat. This one's a little bit older, getting close to being nesting habitat. and they will accept more hardwood in the foraging habitat than they will the nesting habitat. But they need a total of probably 50, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 100 acres of forage habitat for each group of birds, for each family group of birds. And they are territorial. They're not gonna like it if other red-cockaded woodpeckers come into their area. They're gonna fight them. Okay, so this is a good example of an active red-cockaded woodpecker cavity. And the reason I call it active is because I know that there is a red-cockaded woodpecker using that cavity tree, going in there every single night to roost. And the reason I can tell that is because look at the reddish sheen on the bole of that tree. It's kind of a reddish color because every single day that red-cockaded woodpecker that uses that tree comes in and he pecks these little resin wells on the side of the tree. And those resin wells expose the underbark of the tree, which is kind of a brick red color. And he puts these resin wells all over the side of the tree in order to get the sap flowing. So you can see these trees from a long way through the forest because the sap will eventually turn white, but it's clear initially. And these trees that are active get this reddish sheen to them. And that's how you know they're active. You notice the cavity is very round. It's about 2 inches in diameter. You probably can't tell the size of it from this picture, but it is about 2 inches in diameter, very round. And that's the way the bird likes it. If a cavity gets enlarged by a competitor or a predator, then that will make the bird or the eggs, whatever's in the cavity, more subject to predation. Because a raccoon could climb that tree. If it gets enlarged, say it's a 4-inch hole, he could reach his whole darn arm in there, pull out the chicks or pull out the eggs or even the adult. But that's the reason the birds peck these resin wells on the tree, to get the sap flowing all the way down the tree. Raccoons, possums, they don't like getting all that sap in their fur. Flying squirrels, most of us don't think about flying squirrels because we don't see them very often. But there's a lot of flying squirrels out in these habitats. They're only active at night, and that's why we don't see them. But they are chief competitors to these birds' cavities. They just really want to get in. I mean, they just love these holes. And if there's not a lot of sap flowing down that tree, they'll try to steal that hole from that red-cockaded woodpecker. Now here's an example of an inactive red-cockaded woodpecker cavity. This cavity may have been used by red-cockaded woodpeckers, maybe even for decades, but currently it's not being used, and you can tell it's not being used because you don't see that reddish sheen from the underbark of birds currently pecking on the bark of that tree. Also, you'll notice the sap has turned from a clear color to a yellowish color, and now it's a white and gray color. And that's kind of the progression of the sap as it gets older and older and older on the outside of that tree. And you'll also notice on the top side of this cavity here, you'll see it looks like it's been enlarged a little bit. That may have something to do with why the cavity has been abandoned or is not currently being used. Or it could just be the bird has died and there's no other birds that need a cavity right in that area. Sometimes some of these holes will get filled up with water. Particularly if a pileated woodpecker comes along and pecks on the inside of that, on the bottom of that cavity, then he could change the dynamics of the slope of that entrance so that the water, when it rains hard, the water's not leaking back out the hole, but it's going inside the hole, and it could fill up with water. And of course, that makes it relatively unusable for red-cockaded woodpeckers as well. So around these colony sites where birds are constantly building these cavities or excavating these cavities, you'll see a fair amount of what we call starts. And they're called starts because they're cavities that have just been started, but they're not completed yet. And the reason I can tell this one's not completed is because there are no resin wells around it. You don't see any sap flowing from resin wells on this tree. They don't start putting the resin wells around these cavities until the cavity is just about complete. And since this one's not complete, they haven't started putting the resin wells in. You'll see a little bit of sap coming out of the hole itself from where the birds have been working the cavity, trying to get it deeper and deeper. But this start may be kind of inactive right now. The birds will sometimes work on starts for months at a time, and then they may stop working on them. It might have something to do with the weather or the season. In the wintertime, they don't have as much time to work on cavities. They're spending more time finding grubs and food and victuals. So some of these starts may go inactive for months or even years at a time, but they could come back to it and finish it off, and hopefully some bird could use it then. And what's kind of interesting is these cavities are used by many species in the ecosystem. So because they're constructed in live pine trees, these cavities are being used for decades, maybe, by red-cockaded woodpeckers, but then could be abandoned or at least inactive and could be used for decades by other species as well. You could have, bluebirds, maybe other woodpeckers, but certainly flying squirrels, all kinds of critters use these cavities for decades after the red-cockaded woodpeckers have finished using them. And this is just a close-up shot of a resin well on the side of the tree. You can see some of the sap on the side of that tree that indicates it's a red-cockaded woodpecker tree. And if you look inside or right on the top of that resin well, you'll see kind of a reddish sheen, which means the bird has recently worked on it, pecked on it, and exposed that reddish underbark. And as time goes by, if a bird stops using it, that reddish color kind of gets weathered. It turns to a brown color or a gray color, and eventually you won't see that red anymore, which means it's inactive. And you can actually survey a red-cockaded woodpecker population by looking at how many active trees are in an area. So you could take a certain population, count the number of active trees, and then you'd know how many birds are there, because only active trees have red-cockaded woodpeckers using them. Yeah.
How many birds would stay in one?
That's a great question. Only one bird for every cavity, and that's what makes it such a good index technique, because one bird per active cavity. You never find two birds using the same cavity, but you will sometimes have two different cavities in the same tree. You could even have three cavities in the same tree, and birds could use each cavity. In fact, that's, I won't say normal, but we see that quite a bit. Two different cavities in the same tree, both of them could be used. You could have the breeding male in one of the cavities and the breeding female in another cavity, or one of the helpers. Helpers tend to be young males, not females. Females tend to disperse, but we'll talk about a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay, so let's just go over what these birds are doing on an annual basis. In the springtime, the days are long, right? And there's lots of insects on the boles of the trees. So it's real easy for these birds to feel strong. They got a lot of food. They're feeling healthy. They can forage from 6 o'clock in the morning till 8:30 at night, on a long summer day. They're probably excavating cavities. They got plenty of time to defend their territory against other birds that might try to invade their territory. And they're laying eggs. The female always lays her eggs in the adult male's cavity. That's another real unique thing about these birds. She never lays her eggs in her own cavity. She's got her own cavity, most likely, but she's going to lay them in his cavity. So he's responsible for brooding the young at night. He's responsible for incubating the eggs at night. But then again, during the daytime, they all may take turns helping with that kind of stuff. But at night, it's his responsibility to take care of those eggs. In the summertime, the birds still pretty long daylight. The days are warm, still lots of insects being produced. Birds are real healthy. It's time for the eggs to hatch, and those young are probably fledging. Fledging means birds leaving the nest. So the young birds are fledging, but the young birds are not able or smart enough to get in cavities yet. It's nice to have a cavity for every single bird, and in fact, it's very important. These birds are long-lived. Most passerines live very short lives. Like a bluebird may live 3 to 5 years if it's lucky. Red-Cockaded woodpeckers can live 10 to 15 years or more. In fact, we had some birds on the Savannah. We had one bird on the Savannah River site that we banded as an adult 16 years prior, so we knew it was at least 17 years old. So my point is that long-lived species, really populations of long-lived species are highly determinant on mortality factor. So if you're a long-lived species like a red-cockaded woodpecker, you need to lower your mortality rate, which means you get into cavities every single night. If you're roosting out in the open, an owl can catch you. You're subject to the weather, the rain and the cold is getting on you. You're not going to be as healthy. So you really need to have a cavity if you want to try to live a long life as a red-cockaded woodpecker. So during the summer, these young, even though they've fledged, they're not smart enough really to have their own cavities yet. So they're roosting out in the open. High mortality rate, they're getting picked off by owls, or they're just subject to, cold weather. Not cold weather in the summertime, but at least they're getting wet, if it rains. Then in the fall, the days are starting to get short, things are cooling off, but you still have a fair number of insects. By this time, the young are starting to think about getting into cavities. They're getting smarter. Hopefully in that colony site, in around where that family lives, there are some other cavities available. Now, they won't be the best cavities probably, because the dominant male, he's probably got the best cavity in the colony site. The females, the helpers, they've also got cavities as well. So the youngsters, they get the dregs or whatever's left. Hopefully it's not a cavity that's filled up with water or something. They might have to roost out in the open if there's not a good cavity available for them. But they might start working cavities a little bit, but they're still young. They're not very good at working cavities. They're not really healthy strong enough to do it. And plus it takes so long anyway, they just don't have time to make them a cavity real quick. So they may be roosting out in the open. Hopefully by the time the winter rolls around, they will definitely be in a cavity and have a good safe spot to go each night. By this time, of course, all the birds are, I won't say under stress, but it's not as easy of a living as it is during the summertime and the springtime when there's lots of insects. They have to hunt a lot more for bugs on the boles of these trees. But by this time, hopefully all the young have cavities of their own. And the young females are now thinking about leaving their natal site and going out. Remember I said the females are the dispersers in the group. So they are most likely leaving the colony site. They're looking around at all the neighboring areas. Maybe there's an available female or an available male out there somewhere for her. And she may have to go quite a ways until she finds something. Males will normally stay in the colony that they're born in and perhaps help. If they do leave the colony site, they will not probably go as far as what the females go. They just go, maybe a couple miles at the most. So let's think a little bit about why a male would stick around and help as opposed to going out and trying to breed himself. Well, it's a strategy. First of all, if you help raise your siblings, you are passing some of your own genes on yourself, because your siblings have some of your own genes, of course. The other thing is, a helper male is always hoping to eventually obtain breeding status at that site. So he knows that site the best. This is his territory. He, if his dad kicks off, then he then could obtain breeding status. He's usually related to the breeding male in that colony. He's also probably related to the breeding female in that colony. So if his dad kicks off and now he's kingpin in the breeding site right now, he's got control of the territory. He's probably going to have to kick his mom out. She's going to have to go find another spot to breed. She'll disperse, and then he gets breeding status and will try to attract a female of his own. Strange, isn't it? All right. So y'all are probably familiar with the fact that these birds are endangered. They were actually listed as endangered before the Endangered Species Act was actually ratified. So they were among the very first species to be afforded federal protection once the endangered species came to be in 1973. They have now been proposed to be downlisted as threatened. I don't think that's actually gone through yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if within the next year or two we hear something that the birds have been downlisted to threatened. And of course, they are rare primarily due to a lack of old growth pine stands. 500 years ago, all these pine stands, were all old growth. And then, of course, white man came and settled, and we started cutting trees. And now, we're planting and cutting trees within 35 or 40 years. We don't let the trees get very old anymore. But there still are some pockets of old growth timber that these birds have managed to survive in. And even when the birds were first listed as endangered, there were probably 10,000 red-cockaded woodpeckers or more across the Southeast. That may sound like a fairly large number of birds, but remember, most of these birds are in isolated populations, some of them very small populations of less than, say, 10 or 15 breeding groups in each population. So those populations have, we call it winked out, or those populations have been lost and off the landscape mostly over the last 40 years. And the birds are doing pretty well on federal lands. The military lands have done amazing things for red-cockaded woodpeckers, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service on the refuges, even some state lands. So it's really the public lands that the birds have done quite well in and are now, I'll say, thriving, at least in some areas. There's certainly more than 10,000 red-cockaded woodpeckers in the Southeast now, probably more like 4 times that at this point. But the number of populations has drastically declined because there's very few red-cockaded woodpeckers on private lands anymore. All right, so there are many things that managers can do to manage red-cockaded woodpeckers, improve their chances of survival, and increase the population sizes. But these 3 that I've listed here are probably the main 3. We'll go through each of them one at a time, and you can understand how habitat would certainly be the primary one. I mean, they need to have these old pine trees, and they need to have the forage habitat, and they really need these open stands. And of course, these open stands historically were all maintained by wildfires, but now there aren't as many wildfires. We can burn to help manage for these birds, or we can do it in other ways. We can cut the hardwoods out using mechanical methods, either just hand chainsaws or machinery, or you can actually even use herbicides to kill the hardwoods out. But the birds really need these open stands, and this would be a good example. Notice there's little to no hardwoods out here in this stand. It's all pine, and these trees are old, and you'll notice a real good ground cover here. That's probably wiregrass. It might be other kind of grass, but there's a lot of herbaceous vegetation in there, and that creates a lot of diversity in the understory, which creates a lot of insects, which then some of which end up on the boles of the pine trees for the birds to eat. If you don't use fire, you're going to end up with something like this, or you have to go in there and mechanically deal with the mid-story growing up. This picture was actually taken on Croatan National Forest just a couple weeks ago, and I'm going to get up on my soapbox, although I forgot to bring it, just for a minute, and mention, I think wilderness areas, this actually was taken in a wilderness area on the Croatan National Forest. Wilderness areas serve a very good purpose in many situations, but to designate a part of the southern pine forest as wilderness, I think you do a great disservice to the habitat. That's because wilderness areas, you're not allowed to use any kind of machinery to do any kind of work. You can't build roads or houses or, structures, or you can't even build a fire line. And if you can't build a fire line, you're not going to be able to control burn anything. And this is what you're going to end up with. So my personal belief is you do the southern pine forest a great disservice if you can't burn it. And you obviously can't burn it if it's a wilderness area, because you can't construct fire lines. Now, right down the road from the previous picture, I took this picture, and this is outside the wilderness area, and this is not very good red-cockaded woodpecker habitat either, but it can easily be made into good red-cockaded woodpecker habitat. You'll notice some of the trees are marked for thinning, and they'll also go in and cut these hardwoods out. They'll chip the hardwoods and sell the chips on the hardwoods, and they'll thin the pines out, and you could end up with some very good, at least forage habitat right now for red-cockaded woodpeckers. And when I say red-cockaded woodpeckers, this is an ecosystem where there are most of the species in the southern pine forest use these open pine forests under conditions that have burned. So it's not just red-cockaded woodpeckers that you're doing management for. A lot of other things like fox squirrels, things like brown-headed nuthatches, things like wild turkeys, quail, they all use these open pine forest areas because through thousands and thousands of years, the species in this habitat have adapted to these fire-maintained systems. Sure, fire will kill individual animals, but they really depend on having that fire to create the habitat so their populations can flourish. So individuals may get killed, but the populations do much better under a fire-maintained system. Oops. So this is what you'd end up with if you this is a little bit denser than I would like for red-cockaded woodpeckers. They like it a little bit more open, but you'll at least notice that the ground cover is in real good shape. There's not a lot of mid-story in this stand. There's hardly any, I don't see any hardwoods in that stand. So this would be very good forage habitat, and as the trees get a little bit older, could be nesting habitat as well. And of course, as I mentioned, fire is key in these systems to produce habitat for these birds and so many other of their wildlife friends. And the fire does not kill the pines, at least not in most cases. You can have catastrophic fire that kills the overstory pines, but in most cases, at least if the stand is burned on a regular rotation, the fires don't get hot enough. These pines have very thick bark, and they do fine under fire conditions. And hopefully you'll end up with something like this, where the mid-story has all been burned up, all those nutrients have been recycled down into the soil. You get lots of ground cover that's starting to grow back up. This is probably just a month or two after the fire came through. And you'll notice the overstory pine trees have done fine. There's some short pine trees in there that either have been killed or at least brown right now. Some of them may green up and grow into the overstory. But this is what you're looking for red-cockaded woodpeckers and so many of the other species that live in the southern pine forest. All right, next let's talk about the second conservation effort that's real important to these birds, translocation strategies. Now, when I was working for the Forest Service, the Southeastern Forest Experiment Station 35 years ago, we worked out many of the techniques of how you move red-cockaded woodpeckers from one place to another. And of course, you'd want to do that if you have a real big population that's real healthy, has plenty of red-cockaded woodpeckers over here, but in another place you've got relatively few, and you need to kind of add some resurgence, maybe some new genetics into this population. So you move some birds from here to here, and the way you do that, well, there's, of course, you can move different ages birds, different sex birds. You can move whole groups of birds. But what we learned is it's these young females that are the natural dispersers in the population anyway. They're usually the ones that are leaving the natal site anyway, so they're more kind of genetically adapted to being able to be moved. So, and that's advantageous because in declining populations of woodpeckers, a lot of times you will have solitary males that are on territories, but they've got no females there. So if you have a small population, like we did on the Savannah River site, when I was working for the Forest Service, that's where I was working. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But we had some solitary males, and we learned that the easiest way to get a pair of birds in this small declining population is to move young females, the ones that are going to be dispersing anyway, to those solitary males. And they would be more likely to stay and breed with that male than if you moved an adult female there. You can move an entire group of birds. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't work so well. If you move a male, males very rarely stay where you put them. They're always going to try to go back. they're always going to try to go back to where you took them from. Most of the time, they'll find their way back there somehow. If you take them a real long distance, they probably won't, but they probably won't stay where you put them. But in order to move birds from one place to another, you have to know what bird you're moving. You just can't go catch a bird and look at it and say, oh, I think it looks like a female, I'm going to take her. What you want to do is know ahead of time what bird you're trapping, and you do that by banding the birds in the donor population. I'll call it the donor population area you're taking them from. You need to band these birds so you know individuals. You band them with a color code, and you might be able to see on that picture, once it gets enlarged, there you go. Yeah, maybe you can see there's a band on that bird, but you usually band these birds when they're nestlings. So you can pull them out of the cavity and band them, stick them back in the cavity, and then you get 4 or 5 birds, however many birds were in that cavity. You can get those a lot easier than you can trap them as adults. A lot less effort. And, and so once you know individuals in the donor population, what age they are, what sex they are. Yeah, Alan, what were you thinking?
How do you know what sex they are as nesting?
Well, when they're real small, you can't tell, but you wait until later stages. I think it's at least 12 days old, something like that. And then the males get a red dot on the top of their head. And they don't keep that red dot. Remember I told you that red-cockaded woodpeckers don't have red except for that little, well, I lied because the nestlings do get a red dot, and they will keep that dot until they molt the first time in the fall. So when they leave the nest, you can see that, you might be able to see that red dot, but yeah, they will have the red dot, and so obviously the ones that don't have the red dots are females. Good question. So how do we catch them? We catch them using these nets on a long pole, and you go there in the evening time once you know where that bird's going to roost. So you look through your scope and you check out that bird, and you know, oh, that bird's got a pink band over a blue band on the right leg, so I know that's the young female that I'm planning on catching. And I see her go into that cavity tree for several nights in a row, and I got my plan right now. I am going to get together with my comrades, and we're going to slap that net over that hole as soon as she goes in there in the evening time. And sure enough, she goes in that hole in the evening time just like you knew she would. You put that net up over there, and then you scratch on the tree and you pretend you're a raccoon or something climbing the tree, or maybe you rap on a little bit. She immediately flies back out into the net, and then of course you got to check her leg bands and make sure you got the right bird. And then that very same night, you take her over to where you're going to release her to. So this is still at night. You take her near where the male that you want her to bond with is. If he's got a cavity tree here, somewhere within 100 yards, you're going to put her in a cavity tree close to him. If there's not a cavity tree that's already there, you excavate one, and I'll tell you about that in just a minute. But you put her in the cavity tree, this is still at night, near where he is, and you put a screen over the entrance hole so she can't get back out. You put some thumbtacks on that screen so she can't get out, and you tie a piece of twine onto that screen or that hardware cloth. You bring the twine down to the bottom of the tree, and then you go home and you sleep just like the birds are sleeping all night long. You get up early and you get out there before it gets light, and you wait. As soon as the male exits his hole, he's coming out. First thing he does is start peeping. Beep, 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 just like all red-cockaded woodpeckers do. They're talking, trying to find other birds, particularly if you're a solitary male. You're going to start calling because you want to find another female. So you're always calling, but he's out. As soon as he starts calling, shot out of his hole, you pull on that string, you pull that screen off, and she shoots out the hole, and she starts calling, peep, 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 and they start talking back and forth, and they'll hook up. They will definitely recognize each other. Well, they don't know each other, but they'll recognize each other as red-cockaded woodpeckers. And, but now she doesn't always, immediately take a shining to them and everything's good from then on. She will, obviously she's disoriented. You've moved her into a new habitat where she doesn't know very well. So she's going to spend some time, probably several days to even a couple of weeks, milling around neighboring areas. Where the heck am I, She's looking, try to find if there's a better spot. Maybe she might even think about trying to go home if she knew how to get there. But in the back of her mind, she's always thinking, I know where that male is, and he was looking for a female, So she most likely will end up coming back and pairing with him. At least that's the plan, and it usually works that way when you take a female, a young female, to an established male who has a territory. All right. So I mentioned sometimes there's not, oh, yeah.
I have a question about that. Is this human intervention that you just described because they're endangered?
Absolutely.
And then how do you know when you can stop intervening? How can you figure that out population?
That's a very good question.
Could you repeat the question?
She was interested, yeah, thank you. She is interested to know how you know when you should transfer birds, translocate birds, and then how you know when you should stop doing that in any population. Is that,
Yeah, and also, is this because they're endangered? That's why you have this
right?
intervention program?
And wants to know if it's because they are endangered that we would intervene in this fashion. And the answer is yes. You know, theoretically, once the populations are high enough, you shouldn't have to do any translocating at all. It's only because the population is endangered or the population itself is very small and you're trying to at least increase the population high enough where the birds start reproducing themselves and the population is more flourishing. Once these red-cockaded woodpeckers have plenty of pairs in the area and they're producing chicks on their own, then you shouldn't have to do this anymore. But that's a very good question. Yeah, once, and then so like on the Savannah River site where I worked, we did this quite a bit. We started out with just one breeding pair on that population, 250,000 acres in this area, and there was only one breeding pair on the whole property, and there were two solitary males also that we had an opportunity to move females to. And as that population started to grow, we started moving some birds to any of these males that would establish territories nearby. And they don't do that anymore. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. But yeah, the first 5 years of a very small population is when you really want to focus on moving birds, and once they start to reproduce on their own, you shouldn't have to do it anymore. Okay, so the last management technique that I want to talk about is artificial cavity excavation. This is also some work I did when I was with the Southeastern Forest Experiment Station. I was managing that red-cockaded woodpecker population on the Savannah River site. The Savannah River site is actually a nuclear production facility for our nation's defense. That's where they produce the plutonium to make our nuclear bombs. Well, so they have several reactors in the center, and they have this huge buffer area that's all managed by the Forest Service around there. And it was relatively young habitat. Probably most of the trees were somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 years old, not nearly old enough for red-cockaded woodpeckers to use, but there were some stands that were much older and still had some old red-cockaded woodpecker cavity trees in them. And as I said, there was still one breeding pair on that entire property plus two solitary males on that property when we started work in 1985. But in order to help these birds flourish, I knew that I had to increase their survivorship. These birds were dying, you know, at a relatively young age. A lot of them were getting picked off by predators and stuff because they were roosting out in the open. And the habitat was really in poor shape. So we got the habitat in good shape. That was a primary thing. I mean, you just can't do any kind of management unless you get the habitat in good shape first. But once we thinned the hardwoods out, thinned the pines out, got it more open, started increasing rotation ages, so the trees started getting older and older. Then, in order to get these birds so that they all had cavities, I developed this chainsaw technique, or what I call the insert technique, for excavating red-cockaded woodpecker cavities. And so This is an example of an insert. It's got, it's basically just a block of wood, and the hole for the red-cockaded woodpecker has been pre-drilled. It's a large hole that goes down through the top, and the entrance cavity hole in the front, and then you cap it off and seal it real good with some putty and glue, and then you put this metal faceplate on the front, which keeps larger woodpeckers or large squirrels or something from enlarging the cavity, because you don't want that to get enlarged. And also that PVC sleeve on the inside of the entrance also prevents things from enlarging the cavity. But so that's the block of wood, that's the insert we call, and then you can climb these Swedish climbing ladders up the tree, and you cut a hole that is exactly the same size as that box. The tree has to be about 15 inches in diameter or bigger to be able to structurally take inserting a box like that. And then you slide that box or that block of wood with the pre-drilled hole right into the hole you just cut. This is Jenna Beeger. She was my red-cockaded woodpecker biologist with North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. She worked for us for several years. And you can see some little nicks in the tree where she's taken her chainsaw after she cut the cavity and started some resin wells for the birds right there. And just within a couple hours, you'll start seeing little beads of sap come down on that tree. And it doesn't hurt the tree. You know, it's just exuding some sap. Those nicks aren't very deep. They're just into the cambium layer of the tree. And that sap flow, of course, will help attract red-cockaded woodpeckers that are roaming around the landscape. And when they see that sap and they see that hole, they'll think, hey, this might be a good place to stay. And then when the bird starts using the cavity, he'll peck his own resin wells on the side of the tree. And in many cases, you can't really tell these excavated cavities from a natural one. And of course, this is another technique that we hope we don't have to do forever. This is a technique that you use in a population that is very small, and you're trying to increase the population size until the birds get healthy enough where they're all excavating cavities on their own. Now, that was a description of the technique that I came up with, but at the very same time, back in the late 1980s, there was a girl from NC State University by the name of Carol Copion, and she developed a different technique using a drill. And that technique has worked out tremendously as well. So both techniques are being used throughout the entire Southeast now for red-cockaded woodpecker management. Both techniques have their advantages and disadvantages depending on, you know, the age of the tree and you know, the ability of the excavator, all those kind of things. So they've both been very successful in helping. This is my very last slide, and I just wanted to describe a little bit about how successful these management techniques have been. I mentioned on the Savannah River site we had only one breeding pair in 1985 when we started doing that work. When I left the Southeastern Forest Experiment Station in 1990, we had 16 breeding pairs on the Savannah River site. And last year, I got some data. Last year, there were 145 breeding groups on the Savannah River site, over 600 red-cockaded woodpeckers. And that very same year that I finished developing that technique to excavate the cavities, Hurricane Hugo hit the Francis Marion National Forest and obliterated 90% of the cavity trees for red-cockaded woodpeckers on the Francis Marion National Forest. That forest was one of the healthiest populations of red-cockaded woodpeckers we had anywhere until Hurricane Hugo hit. It snapped off 90% of the trees or blew them over. So we went down for several months. I had a couple of crews. There's a couple other crews working with the drill technique, and we did nothing but excavate cavities down there. And those birds have recovered unbelievably so. In fact, that's one of the recovered populations of red-cockaded woodpeckers. Very healthy population right now. And of course, we use these techniques on the game lands here with North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission too. Two of the big game lands where we've got red-cockaded woodpeckers up in the sand hills and on Holly Shelter here on the coast. Some of you may have been birding down there. And the birds have responded real well there too. Both those populations have just about doubled in the last 25 or 30 years. Hopefully we've got time for some questions. Yeah.
1 second, please.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. Last fall, like that?
Yes.
Okay. Last fall, I feel like, last fall, we saw red-cockaded woodpeckers in our yard in Trent Woods.
Oh, neat.
And it was during the fire in Croatan. So do they leave during the fire that's so helpful for them and then go back? Or was that coincidental, do you think? Maybe we actually could keep them.
It could well have had something to do with the fire. Usually they don't disperse that far. Usually when a fire sweeps through, they just go off, a few hundred yards away or wherever, they're foraging over a 50 to 100 acre area anyway. So depending on where the fire is, they might be on one part of their territory and the fire sweeps to the other. Of course, that was a very big fire last spring, and there could have been entire territories that were either burned over, which could have been good for them, or that was very destructive fire in some places, like in some of the Pecosins, where there's organic soil. The soil actually catches on fire, and then of course the pines can't survive that if the soil catches on fire. And so if those trees got killed, they would definitely have to disperse then. But even just a hot fire that sweeps through there, yeah, it would push the birds off for a while, and it wouldn't surprise me too much if those birds showed up because of that fire. Just moving out ahead of it and just dispersing for a while. I'm sure they probably tried to go back if their entire habitat was destroyed because it was such a hot fire, then they would have had to find somewhere else to go. But even though Trent Woods has some great big pine trees, there's an awful lot of competitors and predators in there because a bunch of hardwoods and other habitat that's not so good for them in Trent Woods. Other questions?
How high are the nests above the ground?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So they try to excavate their cavities. Above the flame lengths of fires that sweep through. So generally, it's going to be, 10, 20 feet or more. A lot of it also depends on the height of the trees themselves. I did some work on the Piedmont National Wildlife Refuge in Georgia, and those trees were all loblolly trees there, but they're great big loblollies and very tall, and all the cavities were up around 40, 50, 60. We even had one 80 feet high, and it was a nest tree. We had to climb it every year to check on the nest. But on Holly Shelter, for example, the trees are very short there. I mean, they're almost all longleaf, and the site is very sandy, so the trees just don't grow as tall. So most of those cavities are only 10, 20 feet high. And I have seen cavities as low as 4 feet high. Now, a fire that sweeps through a site, that has a cavity 4 feet high, that the sap on that tree is probably going to catch on fire, and it's going to burn out that cavity. So that's not a very good spot for a red-cockaded woodpecker cavity at 4 feet, but usually above the height of the flames.
How long does it take from the female to hatch an egg before it's born?
That's a good question. It's not very long. I think it's 14 days. Eric, do you remember? Yeah, 14 days of incubation. Once the eggs are laid, now the female will lay, let me get a little closer to the mic. The female will lay 1 egg a day, like many birds do, and she doesn't start incubating until the 4th egg, the 3rd or 4th egg. But then she will incubate for 14 days after that. And then it's another, I think, 21 days after that until the chicks actually fledge, leave the nest.
I don't have so much, hello?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't have so much a question, but an observation. Only, oh yeah. Only once have I seen excavation in action. And it was down at Patsy's Pond.
Oh, yeah.
And there was this woodpecker that was slightly in the hole, and it would come out with this little piece of wood in its bill. It was about the diameter of a toothpick and the length of a piece of rice, and it would spit it out.
Yeah.
And then it would turn it back into the hole and come back out with another little piece of, like, toothpick and long as a piece of rice. And spit that out. And the paste, and I've seen, contrastingly, pileated woodpeckers tear things apart.
Pileated woodpeckers are amazing excavators.
Like a
They will
wood chipper.
tear, they can tear, it can take 3 years for a red-cockaded woodpecker to excavate a cavity, and a pileated woodpecker can come along and tear it all apart in 30 minutes.
Yeah,
But
they are just so slow.
yeah, but red-cockaded woodpeckers, they also, another thing you might have been seeing is when they excavate cavities, they're pecking on the inside of there, and a lot of that just turns into sawdust. So it's not only the stuff that he's bringing out, a lot of it just kind of filters its way down, and every time he or she's going in and out of a hole, some of that sawdust kind of comes out. And remember, they're cutting these cavities obviously in live trees, so there's sap in there, and their bill will get covered in sap. So a lot of times you'll see when they come out, they get up on top of the hole and they bill wipe. So they're wiping the sap off their bill. And that might have been some of what you saw on the bill, because they don't usually grab pieces of wood and pull them out, although that could happen. Mostly it's sap on their bill. And if you saw them wiping their bill, that's probably what it was. But if they weren't wiping, maybe you're right. Maybe they were just pulling out pieces. Yeah, and you can tell an active start, a start that's actually actively being worked on by looking over top of it. And if you see a bunch of speckling up there, that's where the bird has been wiping his bill off, and that's a bunch of speckling sap just over the hole. And of course that kind of flakes off over months and years, so you won't see that speckling on an inactive or an abandoned start, but you would in an active start. Yeah.
What is the natural range of these birds? Is it just the southeast, and has the range shrunk over decades, or is it still about the same?
It certainly did shrink when the numbers were depleted so much, and that's pretty typical of any endangered species. Is the range contracts to an area that the habitat is the best. And the periphery of the range of birds is usually not so good, right? Because, you go beyond that and there is no habitat, or not enough for the birds to survive. So yeah, they go from Virginia all the way down to Florida and west into Texas. So So that's the natural range of the bird, and that's pretty much back where they are now, although there are some portions, I think, in Tennessee and Kentucky that there were birds that there are none anymore. And there weren't any even in Virginia for years, but there are some back in Virginia now. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, the range contracted somewhat, and now that the birds are doing better, the range is expanding. And there's a lot of people putting a lot of effort into moving birds into new areas and creating better habitat for them.
Well, that kind of leads into my question about new areas. You talked about bringing the females to where there's already a
Yeah.
clan and some bachelors, I guess.
Yeah.
And you've been on our property. So is there a chance that a male and a female would find an area where there's not currently a clan? Question number one. And question number two, how many acres per clan and how many acres per good habitat?
So the acreage is 50 to 100 minimum. Now that's including the forage area too. The forage area and the nesting area would need to be that big. But remember, you don't have to have just habitat for one group, because you never find, like, there's no populations really that have one breeding pair. You got to have multiple breeding pairs to have a population, otherwise they can't reproduce, they're going to end up inbreeding real quickly. So to answer your question, no, there's no chance that you would get them on your property until there were other areas around. You would have to have habitat for a minimum of probably 10 groups of birds before you could expect them to expand into that area. And there aren't, the closest red-cockaded woodpeckers to you are on the Croatan National Forest, which are 20 miles away, maybe 15 miles. Yeah, that's still too far. Think about individual birds when they're dispersing. They have to have a cavity to get into at night, otherwise they're going to have to fly back and forth to their natal site where they've got a cavity. Say they really like your habitat on your property. They might fly over there and say, this is pretty nice, but there's no cavities here, and I can't wait a couple of years to excavate cavities here. So unless you excavated cavities for them, and even if that happened, there's no other woodpeckers around. So they would go there and they'd say, I got no neighbors. Sure, you don't want to fight and to defend your territory. So in some respects, you don't, if you're a red-cockaded woodpecker, you don't want your neighbors so close to you that you're going to be fighting, but you still need neighbors, So, so it really wouldn't serve a purpose for a red-cockaded woodpecker to fly over to your property, try to establish a territory when there's no other birds around.
So when you are establishing new territories, are you bringing in whole clans of birds?
We are, for the most part, no. For the most part, we're only establishing new groups of birds right next to other groups of birds that are already there.
Today, what about burn preserve?
So what about the burn preserve? The Coastal Land Trust has 923 acres that we just thinned right next to the Croatan. We know there's groups not too far. There are some older trees maybe there.
That would be a much better spot to try to attract red-cockaded woodpeckers. And you would still need to excavate cavities.
We got a honeydew for you.
I have to get Eric's help. Both of us are getting kind of old to be climbing trees and with a chainsaw, but we might be able to manage a couple of them.
Any more
But yeah.
questions?
Yes.
I was wondering, that you said that the old growth pines get a disease, and how long do they live after?
They can survive for decades, 100 years after they get this disease. It doesn't affect the live part of the tree. Red heart disease only affects the heartwood of the tree, and the heartwood of the tree is dead anyway. It's the very center part of the tree, and it doesn't push any minerals or water or anything through the heartwood. That part. Now, if that red heart disease gets so advanced that it's like completely rotted the inside of the tree, then it wouldn't be as strong. So a strong wind might come along and snap it off or blow it over. But for the most part, like a longleaf pine could live 200 or 300 years. Longleaf is a very long-lived species, but yeah, it could get this red heart disease at 80, and it could live to be 100, 180.
I have maybe 7 or 10 100-foot tall pine trees, but listening to her, there's not enough territory for them to feed. So my other question is, I know that the bleeding of the sap is a deterrent to rattlesnakes, that because I've seen the buttons, the bark, I have 4 6-inch chunks that a snake could easily crawl up. And my understanding is that the rattlesnakes can, with their infrared eyes, can see that hot woodpecker up there and start climbing trees. But my question, really, are there any other snakes than rattlesnakes that will climb a tree to get into a woodpecker nest?
It's actually several species of rat snakes that climb trees. Rattlesnakes can't climb, but rat snakes are amazing at finding bird nests. It's more of a scent, a smell kind of thing. You know how they smell through their tongue. They stick their tongue out and they get the scent molecules on there, and then they bring them back in and they put their tongue up in the roof of their mouth. There's 2 little holes up in the roof of their mouth, and they can smell that way. And that's how they know where these nests are, because they can, like, birds produce feces, right? And so the adults normally grab the fecal sacs and they try to carry them a long way away from the nest. And that's because if they drop them right down below the nest, rat snakes can smell very easily, and they're just amazing at finding bird nests that way. And they will try to climb these woodpecker trees. You're absolutely right. And but if the sap is well developed on the outside of that tree, I've seen many videos of rat snakes trying to climb up a tree, and as soon as they get that sap all in their scales, they just bail right out and fall to the ground, and they're just writhing, trying to get that sap off of them. So mammals are not the only thing that doesn't like to get sap in their skin. Snakes don't like it either.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, we've got another program coming up in March. It's going to be about chestnut trees, and the name of the program is going to be Chestnut Tree Restoration. Douglas Gill will be presenting, and that will be on March 14th. So we hope you come and join us then. Thank you very much. Do you meet here? Yes, we do. Yeah, we'll be sending out another shout out to let you know about that. We send them out at least twice a month. Okay? Great. Thank you very much for coming.